All right. Good morning. Good morning. Good morning. Good morning. I am Tamara Johnson Shealy. Good morning. And I do apologize for being late this late. I have a very good excuse, and I want to apologize to my trusty co-host over there, Mr. David and Mr. Robert. Good morning, guys.
Good morning.
Good morning. Good morning. I was at the Newton Dems this morning talking about my candidacy to the United States Senate. I talked about all kinds of different things, everybody. I talked about everything specific to us as Democrats and everything. Let me make sure I can get this screen right. Yeah, that's not right. Good morning. Good morning. Good morning. Yeah, that's better. So yeah, I was talking about my candidacy and what it means for us to win in 2020 as Democrats. I'm gonna let you and David this morning kind of take the reins. It was me and some folks last week, but I'm gonna give it to you and David. Let's talk about the history here in Atlanta. What's going on, David? How are you this morning?
I'm doing okay. Why don't you introduce Robert to the people who are watching?
Yeah, I'm gonna let Robert introduce himself. So Robert is a historian here in the ATL. It's a pleasure to know him. This man is a wealth of knowledge about everything historical right here in Georgia and Atlanta. So Robert, welcome to the broadcast. This is not your first visit.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us again.
It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure to be with you two guys and to be able to talk about the history of Atlanta and this country and the world. Atlanta, in many ways is a microcosm of, what's going on in the country as a whole. You see the struggle, the conflict, played out in Washington, D.C. On television, but we actually live it here in Georgia. This Senate race should be very interesting. For the first time in a long time, Georgia's in play. And it should be really interesting to see how this all works out. I was talking, reading a little bit, doing a little bit of study on, the post-Reconstruction era, what we call the Jim Crow era, and about voter suppression. Back then they used guns and rope. Now they're using the law, but it's the same thing. If I remember correctly, Kemp won the election roughly by the amount of voters that were purged from the rolls, which is kind of an interesting coincidence. So here we go again, the same story, different actors, different methods, but it's still the same story. I started this, I have a tour company now. We do cultural history tours of Atlanta. And I started, just because I wanted something to do. Like I said, I'm a historian. I've been in the hospitality business for a long time. I'm a people person and I like to talk. So I just did it sort of casually, but this was around 2016, just before the last election. And I was, listening to the candidates, all of the candidates, and some of the stuff they were saying was just patently untrue. And I just, it just dawned on me that people really just don't know the history. And I'm not just talking about uneducated people. Most of the people that take my tours are college educated, and they don't know this stuff.
Yeah. And so much of the truth is buried in lies. That's why it's just buried in lies.
And it's not just lies. It's not even mentioned. I mean, we've been discussing over the last couple of weeks doing a tour called the African-American Holocaust. And we had an interesting time.
I'm super excited about that tour, Robert. So tell everybody again, we've come up with our date. It's April the 18th. So be on the lookout for this tour. Tell everybody the name of it and what it's going to be all about, Robert.
Okay, it's called the African-American Holocaust. And when people mention, and we had this conversation too when I first mentioned the name, I just called it the American Holocaust. And Tamara, she for a minute she didn't get it. She did, because when we think of the Holocaust, we think of what happened to Jews in Europe during World War II. And that was certainly a Holocaust. I'm not a Holocaust denier. They killed close to 6 million Jews, but it's not the only Holocaust, and it's not the worst Holocaust. And in fact, there was a Holocaust that happened here in this country, and we never talk about it. It's more than denying it. It's not spoken about at all. It's like that period of history never happened, or it's glorified in movies like Gone with the Wind, where we're always happy Negroes, calling Miss Annie, our friend, and our caretaker, and this whole paternalistic view of what slavery was. It was a brutal, sadistic, greedy system driven by greed, and far more people suffer. Go ahead.
And let's stay there. Let's stay there, because so many people tend to say that, oh, that happened so long ago, and I should just get over it. And you weren't slaves. Let's stay there for a minute, Robert, because
Okay.
I think people don't understand how this is carried on for generations in Black families. There's certain things that we do that we can so attribute to slavery. Like, for example, and I know this to be true, and I never understood why. Sometimes when Black people are giving compliments, and I actually read this, and that's how I knew it was like, it was truth to it. Sometimes when little Black kids are giving compliments, you can even go back to the movie Color Purple, when the lady said, "Oh, y'all are so clean." Her children were so clean. That was Oprah's character, and the lady said, "Why don't you come work for me?" So it's like we don't like it, we don't even know how to take compliments. There was a whole article about Black people and taking compliments, and how that was attributed to slavery, and we didn't want them to see some of the good, and we didn't want to recognize some of the good. So we don't even sometimes recognize some of the good in ourselves. So going back to you, Robert, and attributing some of even our behaviors to slavery, and just so many things about slavery still lives today. That's my bigger point.
In fact, there's a book called Post-Traumatic Slave Disorder, written by a woman named Joy DeGauss. And it goes into what the repercussions of 250 years of untreated post-traumatic stress has done to us. And she had the same reaction. This is what motivated her to write the book. If you go actually on YouTube, you'll see a whole bunch of lectures by her talking about the book and the subject matter of post-traumatic stress, post-traumatic slave disorder. And she started this. She was a clinical psychologist, and she was wondering, well, why are we doing all this crazy stuff? As a people, as a race, the crime rates and all that, the broken families, all of dysfunction. And one of the first things they did to us when we came here is they took our names, and we didn't have names, so they destroyed our families, and that happened for 250 years. Far more people suffered under slavery than ever suffered under the Holocaust in Europe. Holocaust in Europe lasted about 10 years. The American Holocaust, which not only included African-American slaves, but Native Americans, they were pretty much wiped out, lasted for basically the Native people, their issues lasted for 500 years. And we're still facing the same repercussions from those. Soldiers come back from Afghanistan after spending 6 months, a year there, and they suffer from post-traumatic stress. So imagine if you were under those kind of conditions for your whole life, and then your children were under those kind of conditions, and their children, and the accumulated social, mental destruction. I mean, the real story here is that we survived and prospered at all. I mean, how many, they wiped out the native population. They couldn't take it. Some of them, most of them died from diseases that Europeans brought here that they had no immunity for. And pretty much the rest were killed. One of the largest cases of genocide and ethnic cleansing the world has ever known, and we never talk about it. I never knew that the first 4 presidents of the United States, I never learned it in school. I did because my parents made an effort to teach me history. But out of the first 7 presidents of the United States, 5 of them were slaveholders. Washington, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, Jackson. And in total, up to the Civil War, most of the people who were presidents owned slaves at one point. Some of them let go their slaves before they became president, but most, and it says something about how important slavery was to the country when so many of the presidents were slaveholders. The power elite, how they became powerful and how they stayed powerful was through the blood, sweat, and tears of people of color. And that includes not only, as I said before, enslaved people of African descent, but also Native people. They went from being 100% of the population to being 1% of the population. And nobody quite, well, what happened to them? Why are they such a small part of the population? A lot of people don't realize that early in our history, Europeans actually took out bounties on killing Native people. In other words, people always think of interesting, how talking about, misguided and misconstrued history. People always associate scalping with Native people. It's a European, it was brought to this country by Europeans. And that's how they paid people for killing Native people, by bringing in their scalps. A lot of people, most people don't know that. So, it was a brutal, sadistic system. Another great book to read is that really gets to it in depth, not only from the political, economic perspective, but also from the personal perspective, is a book appropriately called Half the Truth Has Never Been Told, by a guy named Edward Baptiste. And it talks about not only, the economic importance of slavery. Slaves were the most valuable commodity in America prior to the Civil War. They were worth more than all the railroads, all the factories. Prior to the Civil War, the value of slaves were approximately about $2 billion when the total federal budget was about $25 million. And one of the main arguments that slaveholders made about emancipation was the government couldn't afford to reimburse them for their slaves. So no question, no thought of reimbursing the slaves. But this was a system not fed. They want you to think of it as this paternalistic. We're getting these savages from Africa and bringing them to be Christianized and civilized in America. What could be more savage and brutal than kidnapping people, packing them in ships where they stayed in their own feces and vomit and for months at a time? They were branded, they were beaten. Most of the women were raped. Now, who's the savages here? I mean, you're right. I mean, you can't be an intelligent, useful citizen in this country unless you know your history. And most people don't know history, which is, I think, I do believe has a lot to do with why someone like Donald Trump can become president. Because he can tell all these lies and people don't know how to, they don't have the information to combat it because they don't know the truth. So we're going to do this tour and we're going to
let's get David's kind of like in his world over there. David.
I was just going to mention that I don't have the website in front of me right now, but there is a source that you can use to find out what indigenous First Nation people lived in the area that you live in. There's a geographic map, and there are many folks. I took a workshop last year for faculty and staff at Emory called Microaggressions, and somebody pointed out that a lot of academics are now and people who are in the progressive movement are talking about where they live and acknowledging the First Nations people who were displaced, pushed out of that geographic area. And for us in Atlanta, it's Cherokee and Muskogee and folks like that. I think are the people. But the acknowledgement, I think, is really an important consideration to recognize that all of these Native American names that we have in the area are actually grave markers. They're really unacknowledged memorials to that land stealing and displacement, forced displacement of people. So Jackson was not only a slaveholder, he was not only a very good model for what we're facing now with Trump, because he defied Supreme Court decisions about Native American land, but he's also the one who displaced the people in the Cherokee and Muskogee and folks who are in this area, and put them on a death march out to Oklahoma. But not only that, when they found oil in Oklahoma, they did a second, displacement of those folks who were out there again. So it is a story that I think we need to remind ourselves of, but also that there were lots of working class whites who participated in this system of oppression, but did not benefit from it. And that I think is a big connection to make. That there were a lot of people who were included in the white race, who have really never gotten the spoils that were concentrated in the hands of plantation owners and big business interests, and right down to the present. So when you talk about people being unable to see through lies, I think there's a syndrome there, whatever you want to call it, of thinking and acting white among working class European Americans that is the social basis for this kind of I don't know what to call it, ability to swallow lies, uncritically, because the basic lack of self-awareness that European American working people have towards their actual class status, and the ability over 3 centuries now to convince them that they are something that they are not, namely part of a ruling white race, um, is is one of the areas that I think we really need to focus on. I mean, this has been a bad week. This has really been a bad week, and there is a certain amount of dismay and demoralization. Trump's numbers are now up to 49%, the highest they've ever been. The economy seems to be working for the most active group of people in the political process, namely, the upper middle class. There's 2/3 of the population that still remain in what just been reading is called the Affordability Crisis. Their lives are made precarious by the enormous increase in costs of healthcare, health insurance, other forms of insurance, and other, but the lack of self-awareness, for most of those people who are, thinking and acting white, is such that they can be easily persuaded that the problems that they face are caused by undocumented immigrants and other.
They can't deny right now. We're having Trump in office, David. Right now, you cannot deny that. I say having Trump in office right now, they can't deny that their whiteness has gotten in the way. They cannot deny that.
Well, who cannot deny it? I didn't quite get what you were saying.
I said white America cannot deny that their whiteness is in the way with why things are where they are. White American cannot deny that.
Well, I think that my both mission, my responsibility and the responsibility of other progressive whites is to bring European Americans face to face with these choices that confront them, and unfortunately, that's not quite on the agenda yet. There's enough of a realization that a kind of a transactional realization that that the Democrats can't win elections without African American and Latinx American voters. They cannot win elections, but there are all sorts of issues. I was just reading an article in The Nation by John Nichols, who's from the battleground states, and Nichols is showing the scenario about how Trump could win election, win a second term, with Democrats having 5 to 7 or even 8 million more votes, more popular votes than Trump, and it has to do with the Electoral College, of course, as one part, and it also has to do with what Robert was saying about voter suppression. There is, and the other thing is that this guy Parscale, who is now was in charge of Trump's, what do you call it, media and internet campaign, has now become the chair of his reelection committee, and they have really detailed voter records, so that they know who they can reach, who the Trump lies will be accepted by. So
and that's why what Robert is doing is so important, Robert. That's why this tour on April the 18th is so important. That's why your work is so important. That's why what David is, he's advocating for is so important, because we're in some critical times, Robert. What you think?
I think we are. Yeah. You were going to get ready to say something, David?
By
Hello?
saying that there is going to be an enormous what do you call it, voter turnout, in this election, but it's going to be an enormous voter turnout on both sides, so that we really have to keep that in mind, that the way to win this election is not only to mobilize voters of color, but it's also to keep the black male vote that Trump got. 8% of black men voted for Trump last time around. Keep the black male vote down, and also to not keep it down, but to keep that number low, and also most.
Wait a minute, Robert just gave you a funny look. What was that look, Robert? What were you thinking?
Well, when he said that Trump got black male votes, that I didn't know that. That blew my mind.
Yeah.
Really? Wow.
No, he really did, and there's no there. Well, I'm let me say that I'm not sure of the exact figures, but it was it really surprised me how many black men voted for. Black women are still, the base core of any progressive movement in this country. But the other thing, the third aspect of this, is to eat into the Trump base, particularly of working class whites, who are really, as the Black Agenda report, Glenn Ford said, are really faced with a choice between their mother's health care and being part of the white race. That's how stark the alternatives are for a lot of working class white men.
So here's the dilemma, David. So here's the dilemma. Yeah. They would rather chase white voters than to mobilize black voters. That's the toss-up here with the Democratic Party.
No, I think that this is really different. I'm not talking about those people in the center. I'm not talking about Republicans or the so-called independents. I'm talking about the people who Michael Moore is talking about. In his that is the 100 million people who do not vote. All right, there's a real difference between those who the Democrats, and I would say mostly the centrist Democrats, who are appealing to the middle, to the center. They're talking about appealing to people who already are part of the voting population. Moore is saying that Sanders and Warren perhaps and other people are directing their efforts at people who do not vote. And if those people get involved in the electoral process, it's very likely that a lot of them, a large majority of them, would vote Democratic. There are ways of, there are things that are going on that are really changing the nature of the electorate. For instance, we have no idea at this point what's going to happen to the evangelical vote, because there are younger evangelicals now that are, they're sickened by this guy in office, and there is an increasing, I think, possibly disaffection. This prayer breakfast that he did was just astounding. This very well-known evangelical, conservative got up and talked about forgiving your enemies. And Trump disagreed with that. He said, I don't agree with what you're saying. Not even realizing that's Jesus talking, so we really don't know what pressure is undergoing. And guess who has the best contact with people like that, who speaks their language, of white evangelicals? It's African Americans. African Americans know, much better than white liberal progressives, their Bible, the values of what we might call true Christian values, and for God's sake, you've been forgiven the enemies. Right up to the guy who I don't want to even say his name, the guy who killed those people in Mother Emanuel in Charleston,
South Carolina. So let's bring it back to Robert. So Robert.
Well, I think David is spot on. The same people that voted for Obama twice voted for Trump. And so what happened there? I mean, why? I think it was not so much, they thought that they were going to, I think the country's tired of politicians, and they saw Hillary Clinton as a politician, and they thought that Trump would be different, that he would be, anything but another politician that we had before. And I think that's what was the initial thought of all those people, like I said, who voted for Obama twice and then wound up voting for Trump. I hope that they've realized the error of their ways. I think David is right on. I think the key to this election is the coming together of people of color and poor whites who have not benefited from the system. People, history, again, you can't be an effective citizen unless you know your history. And a famous historian, I think his name was Ira Berlin, said, history is only tangentially about the past. It's really about the present, because we use that, what we think is the correct history, to guide our actions in the present. And if you don't have a correct history, you're going to make these kind of errors. We talk about America being a democracy. I challenge that. I think America is trying to be a democracy. I mean, if we look at what we think of today as basic principles of democracy, majority rule, one person, one vote. When America was founded, a very small portion of the population could vote. Women couldn't vote. Of course, people of color couldn't vote. Even, and I think this really needs to be brought home, poor whites couldn't vote. You had to own property in order to vote in America. And it wasn't until Andrew Jackson that even poor whites could vote in this country. So the United States is struggling to become a democracy. It is, and it was founded as an oligarchy, as a republic. And a republic is the political structure that comes from an oligarchy. There's a reason why the first 4 presidents were slaveholders from Virginia. Virginia had the most slaves, and there was a clause in the Constitution called the 3/5 clause. Probably one of the most cynical and undemocratic pieces of the Constitution that you could ever think of. Black people were counted as 3/5 of a person for representation in Congress. Wrap your mind around that. People who had no rights were being counted to determine how many Congress people would be from a state. I mean, what kind of hypocrisy, could lead people to even think about doing something like that? That's why you have 4 presidents from Virginia, because they had the most slaves, and so they had an unbalanced, overbalanced, an inappropriate balance of power in this country. So we didn't have a democracy back then. Women couldn't vote. I mean, women didn't get to vote in this country until 1920. So you can't have a democracy when the majority of the people can't participate. You know. Go ahead. Go ahead, David.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that that carries over into the present with people who are incarcerated being counted not where their homes are, but in the place where they are incarcerated, which greatly inflates the influence of those voters in those areas that are far from urban centers. And where those people can't vote. I mean, nobody in prison can vote. So it's a really sharp contradiction to the logic of democracy, that you first incarcerate people for what they've done and what they've not done, and then put them in a non-voting category, and then use their bodies, almost as almost as cynical a way as you're saying about the 3/5 rule. Well, just as, in fact. So I think you're right about that, Robert, and I think that what it does is it creates a whole series of disconnects with the within the political process, that people just cannot think straight, when it comes to these kind of things, and the the vote expanded for working class whites, the vote was taken away from free people of color in states like Massachusetts, New York, Pennsylvania, where there were free people of color. Their property requirements for voting were actually raised, while those of whites were lowered. So what message is that sending? It's sending the message that voting and participation in the political process is a white privilege. That's what it's saying. You have to be part of the white race in order to be a full citizen of the country, even if you are free and 3 generations of your ancestors, in Boston or some of these other places. I mean, there are Black churches that in the Northeast. I lived a mile away from one that was founded in the middle 1750s. So there have been anyway. You get the point. There's a logical disconnect between the logic of solidarity and the logic of the logic of Christianity, and the way that that European Americans behave. And in some ways, this is the mirror image of the post-traumatic slavery syndrome. It's like the Ira Berlin that's a wonderful reference there. I've also heard it said that history does not repeat itself, but it does rhyme.
Yeah, yeah.
And that's really what we're seeing. We're seeing that. So there's a tremendous message of love that we need to get across to people, and I think that sharing wisdom and knowledge is a big part of that message of love, sharing the history. And
go ahead, let Robert jump in. We got about 5 more minutes left in the broadcast. Go ahead, Robert.
And like I said, I just want to reiterate what Dave is saying. We have to develop some new alliances, And I think from some people that we didn't think necessarily, we had alliance with, and one of those people, of course, they are working class whites, and also young evangelistic people. There's an incredible church, and I think it's a window on the future. It's called Cornerstone, and it's here in the West End.
Oh.
And in an age where church attendance is dwindling, the age of young people are not going to church anymore. I go there occasionally. I'm not a Christian, but I go there for the spirit. I'm not a religious person, but I like to think of myself as a very spiritual person. It is one of the most there was a saying, and it's still to a large part true. One of the most segregated areas in American life is church on Sunday. This is one of the few churches which is about 50-50 black and white. And I think the average age of the parishioner is probably under 40. It's a remarkable scene. I go there just because I go there and I say, this is the future. I don't get discouraged. And when I do, I go to Cornerstone and I say, okay, I mean, these kids are your generation. Tomorrow is on point. And maybe, unfortunately, it won't happen until all us, people in my generation die out, and you guys, take over. But I'm optimistic about the future. I'm optimistic. I'm optimistic about the future. I think that there are new alliances that can be made, and I want to talk more, and I want to end this on a positive note. I think that this is a defining election time for us. I'm pretty sure that for the first time, you will have an avowed socialist running for president. I mean, unless something really weird happens, I'm pretty sure that Bernie Sanders will be the Democratic nominee for president. And then on the opposite side, you have Donald Trump. So you have a clear and really defining, we can have a really clear defining argument about what direction this country can go to. There'll be two people who are polar opposites. And I think that we should take this opportunity to have a discussion about what America really is, and where it's come from, and where we want to take it. Do we really want to? Go ahead.
Yeah, I actually said this to some students at Emory. I said, we're going to redefine where the center is with having this election this time. Is like, where is the center? And we're going to redefine that right now. And I do agree with you. This is totally a defining moment in history.
Yeah.
And we're living it.
I call it, Robert, I think you're absolutely right about that. And what Tamara's saying is I think we have to stop this thing about the pendulum swing. We need to change the fulcrum of the pendulum, the place where the pendulum swings from. And if we can shift the fulcrum, and to some extent it has already shifted. Healthcare as a right was not on the radar in 2015 or before that. After Sanders, healthcare as a right is the consensus, the overwhelming consensus, at least of the Democratic Party. Same is true with a number of other issues, and in spite of all of the denials, climate change is now, the environmental crisis is now on the really front and center on the agenda. So you're right. I think, right and right on. Let me put it that way.
Awesome. And we're going to stop right there because we're at the top of the hour. I know we started late, but I definitely wanted to keep us on schedule. So my apologies. This morning I was at Newton County Democrats, where I actually had an opportunity to speak and talk about all the things we just talked about in this broadcast. So Robert and David, I just want to thank you for all the work that you've done. None of the work that either of you've done is in vain. My generation and my children's generation, I'm so proud of what I'm seeing with them, how they get it. And like Robert just said, it's like, something's happening, and it's a beautiful thing to watch. So we're getting there. It's just been a hard road to getting there, I guess. But we're getting there. So we will be back next.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Robert. You want to say one final thing?
Yeah, there was a phrase around the 1900 was called the Great White Hope, and it was a reference to someone beating the first black heavyweight champion,
Johnson. Yeah.
Jack Johnson. And I think in a way, Trump is that Great White Hope, that they somehow that mentality, that racist mentality, but somehow we have to find some white man to bring our country back to us. And that mentality needs to be crushed forever. And I think your generation, which is the first generation, Tamara, that was not born into slavery or segregation. And it's been a whole paradigm shift, because you didn't have that. You grew up expecting different things, and I'm so proud of that.
Yeah. And that's,
we'll be back. Go ahead, David. You want to final word?
I was going to say to European Americans, Jim Crow is a scrawny bird. there ain't a lot of meat on those bones. So if that's what you're looking for, your kids are going to be hungry. That.
So we'll be back next Saturday. Power to the people. We'll be back next Saturday right here with my friend David. And thank you, Robert. You're always a friend to this broadcast. Y'all look for the flyer. We're going to be doing this African-American Holocaust tour with Mr. Robert Thompson. I'm looking so forward to it. That's April the 18th, Mr. Robert. Am I right here?
Yes, that's right. That's a bus tour. Yeah.
Pack the bus. We're going to get a bus and we're going to move around, and he's got a lot to share, and it's going to be a great tour. So look for that flyer. It'll be coming out really soon. Thank you guys, and you have a great week. Have a great week.
You too. Take care.
Bye-bye.
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 Thanks, Robert.